Well, hello everybody. Today I wanted to talk about teenage emancipation. This is a topic that I have not dealt with directly, although I have dealt with it indirectly in the past. If you go back several years, I had a series of videos about whether minors should be able to produce pornography. And, you know, typically with my videos, there's a lot of consensus, there's a lot of preaching to the choir, and there's not a lot of disagreement. I believe those are the most contentious videos that I've made, other than Venus Project videos, where, even among libertarians, there was very heated back and forth for a very long time. And it was an issue, though, that I always looked at like, these age of consent laws, these age of maturity that we have, the 18, 21, 16. There's different ones depending on what you're talking about. Although 18 tends to be the biggest one in the United States, where arbitrarily it seemed, at least it seemed to me, you went from a person who was legally not enfranchised, right? I mean, not just in that you couldn't vote, but that you were legally discriminated in numerous ways. You couldn't own property, you couldn't get married, you couldn't sleep with who you wanted, you couldn't work either at all or highly restricted on where and when you could. There might be curfews enacted on you. You could not have a say in your own body in terms of medical procedures. Your parents or the state would have plenary powers when it came to that. There were also lots of mandates that you would have to attend school, and obviously there were some options in school. You could maybe attend private school, you might be able to homeschool, but some sort of education is mandated. And there's even a parallel juvenile justice system where you don't have a lawyer, you don't have a jury, uh, where the penalties are completely arbitrary. And we've had, some extremely horrible cases of abuse here, where judges were just handing out long multi-year terms or whatever to teens because they were getting kickbacks from the private prison that was offering them. Um, and so, to me, it seemed like, at least in my anecdotal observation, that a lot of these people who were minors technically um, were capable of acting as adults. They were smart enough. They were physically capable. They were more or less just as capable and thoughtful as adults are, and that the laws against them were somewhat arbitrary. But I didn't have a lot to add after those videos. And last fall, I had the serendipitous event of listening to Tom Woods interview Dr. Robert Epstein, a Harvard psychologist, on his book Teen 2.0: Saving Our Children and Families from the Torment of Adolescence, which, by the way, is a great interview if you'd like to go see that. Here it is. And I thought, well, this sounds pretty interesting. Maybe he has some quantitative and qualitative data to back up what, for me, was at that point just kind of anecdotal intuition, and indeed he does. I'd say he advances three very broad lines of evidence. One, historically. If we look, the idea that we treat teenagers, people who have gone through puberty, as kids, as children, is not a long-term thing in the West. It's not a long-term thing in the United States. It's something that we can trace back to the late 19th century. Up until that point, once you went through puberty, you were essentially an adult. You might still live with your family, they might still take care of you to some extent, but you were independent legally. You could make contracts, you could have a job, you could do work, you could get married, and in fact many people did. So there's that line of reasoning. There's also the related, looking at contemporary societies that exist today that are not in the West. Whether this is in India or throughout Africa or wherever else, we find that this is still common for a large portion of the world. And then this third line of argument is he actually developed competency tests that would measure people's ability to make decisions, to understand the ramifications of what they were doing. And it's a fairly lengthy test. And if you give this test to 18 to 70-year-olds, they get an average score. And if you give it to 13 to 17-year-olds, they get, I think he said, 1 or 2 points less on average, and 30% of them score higher than the top half of the adults, so-called. Basically showing that not only is it historically precedented that people who have gone through puberty are capable of having the full rights like anyone else and should be treated as such, that he's developed a test that kind of can show that. And he goes even further to say they because they are functionally adults, the fact that we treat them like children is actually causing many of the problems that we associate with, quote, adolescence. And he has a big problem with that term. He thinks that there is the period of childhood, the prepubescence, that you go through puberty, and I suppose the period of puberty is itself a gray area, right? The first day you start to the day that, that you've actually become a man, there probably is a gray area there. But once you have finished puberty, or nearly finished puberty, or at some point during that process, you become physically an adult. And there's a common argument here that, well, your brain continues to develop as you get older, so like a 21-year-old's brain is not the same as a 25 or a 30-year-old's brain. And that's very true. Your brain is not static at any point in your life. It's constantly changing. You're always having new experiences. But there isn't some really profound quantum leap that happens, or qualitative change that happens when you're 17 or when you're 18 or when you're 21. The quantum leap, the huge quantitative change that happens, and this is when we're talking about moral reasoning, about problem solving, about sense of self, about using reason, about ethics, that happens when you go through puberty. It doesn't happen when you're 18. And yes, it's true that there are teenagers, there are 13, 14, 15-year-olds who are not very smart, who are not very reasonable, who are going to make dumb decisions. But that is something that is also true of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. His argument here is not that there should be mass emancipation of everyone, but that all emancipation should be based on competence. And so if you have somebody who is, to use an unpopular term, mentally retarded, and they're 40, you don't treat them like an adult and say you can vote and you have control over your body, if they're severely mentally retarded anyway. Whereas if somebody is clearly competent, clearly capable, clearly understands what he or she is doing, and they're 14, then that should be respected. So the book is actually quite interesting. He goes into the history of how we transitioned away from treating teenagers, post-pubescent kids, children, adults, as adults, into treating them like children. And actually, if you listen to the interview with him and Tom Woods, he was kind of quite ornery and forceful, because Tom kept saying, "Oh, these kids," and he got quite angry every time Tom Woods said kids, because he's like, kids is from the Bible. Kids is a term that you apply to prepubescent goats. So calling a prepubescent child a kid makes sense. But once they've gone through puberty, they are literally not a kid anymore. They are an adult. They are physically an adult. They can rear children. They are physically and mentally as capable, statistically, as anybody else. And he goes into a lot of the stuff about the brain. Your brain, it does change throughout your whole life, but it reaches a maximum size, and then it starts to decline from then on. And it's not just the size that declines, how quick you are, how witty you are, your actual IQ. Like the intelligent quotient is measuring everyone in that age cohort, right? So if you have 120, or if you have 100, then you're 35, then that is the average IQ for someone who is 35. It's not the average IQ for everyone who ever existed. So if you're looking at IQ, mental acuity, and brain size, when does it peak? It peaks when you're 14 or 15. Not when you're 21, not when you're 18, not when you're 35, not when you're 40, not when you're 50. Your brain peaks in size when you're 13 or 14. It starts to shrink. By the time you're 70 or 80, it's the size of when you were 8 or 9. And that kind of helps me understand geriatrics a whole lot better. So it's not that they are less capable in any measurable sense. That's simply not true. They are just as capable, at least. Now, one of the other things that he goes along with this argument is, say his argument is true, that they are physically and mentally adults, but they are trapped in a system where they have no rights, where they are constantly at the whim and control of others, either their parents or the state or the schools or whoever else, that is going to be psychologically extremely burdensome for them. And that many of the things, of the angsty, tumultuous things that we associate with adolescence, are actually a result of this. And that societies that do not treat post-pubescent adults as children do not have these same problems. And so people say, well, my teenager's gothy and trendy, and he parties and he drinks and he's stupid and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, but if he had a job, if he had the responsibility, and that's a big part of his argument here. Look, he's not talking about, oh, you're emancipated, you can just do whatever you want. He's like, you are now responsible for yourself, you are free, you can earn money, but you also have to you owe any debts that you incur. You're liable criminally for anything you do. There's no juvie court. There's no special slap on the wrist. If you're 14 and you kill someone, that's going to be as serious as if you're 25 or 40. And like, it's very interesting because like they've done studies apparently where as soon as people enter the workforce and they're no longer dependent on their parents, the rate at which they party and get wasted all the time goes down a lot. I mean, in my anecdotal experience, I don't know that that's true, but apparently that is empirically known fact. Um, he traces the history of how this developed in the United States, and one is always struck when we look at the late 19th and early 20th century, the later part of which we usually call the progressive era, although I think it definitely had really important antecedents in the late 19th century. It's really quite fascinating. There were multiple cases where municipalities or states would pass restrictive laws about contract or work, telling minors they can't work in certain professions or a certain number of hours, and these would go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, up until the New Deal, basically was saying, you can't do this. You can't force adults, 16, 15, 14-year-olds, that they tell them that they can't work. One character who looms very large in this book, and it's one that I've encountered before, was Jane Addams, or Addams. Here's a picture of her. And I bought this book as it was referenced heavily in his work. So Jane Addams, I'll call her by that name, was the founder of Hull House. And if you don't know what Hull House was, it was basically like a private home for the indigent, for delinquent children, whatever, in Chicago. And they kind of spread all over the country, and a huge number of people went through them. And I don't just mean like patients who were using it as a service, but I mean administrators who went through it and that shaped their thinking. It was absolutely instrumental in the creation of juvenile courts. And there was this argument that it's fascinating. Like, a lot of these late 19th century tycoons, the Carnegies, these Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, a lot of these people, I think that they had what they believed to be true altruism. And this is not just on this topic. This is probably a much bigger topic. They looked at the world and they saw things that they thought were troublesome. And some of those impulses that they had, I think today would be viewed as unbelievably patronizing, racist, and clearly self-centered. But I think a lot of the times they were really quite sincerely felt. And Jane Addams looked around and she saw young people in the streets doing things that she didn't approve of. She looked at them and say, why aren't you should be doing, I have an idealized version of what you ought to be doing and you're not doing it. And so we should have a criminal justice system that specifically addresses that. And so there are all these very wide-ranging truancy laws and such that you could go and just basically sweep up all the young adults and say, well, you're talking back, you're violating curfew, you're disrespecting your parents, so you are now institutionalized. Very similar to, say, having a law against marijuana and how that could be used to wage war against, say, the African American population is probably somewhat analogous. And then to infantilize and say you shouldn't be responsible, you shouldn't be able to make decisions for yourself, either your parents or the state ought to do this. And it was also very important in the spreading of compulsory education. It's interesting. Apparently, the first public schools in Massachusetts were only based on people who needed them, right? It was only for people who didn't know how to read. If you knew how to read, you didn't have to go. It was considered superfluous and unnecessary. It was kind of the way that we would look at welfare today. If you're poor, okay, you go on welfare. But if you're not poor, you don't go on welfare. If you can't read, if you're a dipshit, if your parents failed you, if you didn't learn the Bible in Sunday school, whatever, okay, go to school. If you can, if you have competence, that you shouldn't have to go. So what I find interesting is this Robert Epstein here, Harvard-educated guy, mainstream guy as far as I can tell. He basically thinks high school should be abolished. He thinks that there should be no age of consent laws, that there should be no laws requiring people to go to school, that there should be no laws preventing people from working. If you're competent, that you should be able to work. I mean, all the way up to and including the coal mines. Uh, he thinks that it is patronizing and outrageously unjust to go to someone and say, "I forbid you to do this," because who are you to tell that person? Well, he's not 18 yet, so he can't make the decision. Bullshit. Bullshit. Now, he's in favor of competency based, right? So if you can demonstrate that you are responsible enough, then you can have the job. So if you are a bumbling idiot and you can't sign your name and blah blah blah, then you wouldn't be judged competent. You'd still live under the protective paternalism of your parents or your guardian or whoever was taking care of you. And that is something where I kind of think I would differ from him a little bit, because he talks a lot about, well, there'll be a test for this and a test for that, a test for a driver's license, and if an 11-year-old passes it, he should drive. Okay, I definitely think that would be better than we have today. I would wonder about who would make these tests and how hard would they be, and who would decide what is an appropriate rubric. And I have in mind here like these tests that they have to allow you to get a concealed handgun or not. And a lot of states will just give them to you, no questions asked, and some states will make it essentially practically impossible for anyone to do it. And this kind of competency-based testing regime is very susceptible to that. I think that I would go in the negative route of, if somebody is asserting their rights and saying they have the right to do something, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that they can't. So if if we're talking full ANCAP here, like, this is going to be handled by whatever goods and services they're interacting with otherwise. So like, there would be no law against a 10-year-old driving a vehicle. But the toll road or the insurance company or the private road company or whoever's running in it is going to have a say in who gets to drive there, and they're going to have their own criteria. And it's possible they might say, "Oh, nope, you've got to be 18," but more likely they're going to want some kind of certification of your ability. But if you want to drive on your own, or you have your own private place, or it's a road that sufficiently doesn't give a shit, you probably could get away with it. And that's just one example. I could also be talking about employment. I think that employers will look at it like, okay, if we just hire somebody who's completely incompetent, we have liability issues. If we hire a child, a true child, a kid, who is not developmentally at the point where they can handle the responsibility of whatever job is in question, then they're opening themselves up to lawsuits if anything happens. So I think employers would look at it like, a kid comes in for a job, there won't necessarily have been a state test, but they might say, okay, I think this is going to be highly contingent on what the position is, right? If you're talking about being a paper boy or something like that, they're probably not going to ask any questions. If you're going to be handling heavy machinery or something that could potentially hurt yourself or somebody else, they're going to want a higher standard. And what that standard is, I hate to sound like like a market fundamentalist, but I think the invisible hand should decide that. I don't trust in the ability of the government either to beneficently create a suitable test, or even optimally create one, assuming they even have the best interests of everyone's heart. But that is a kind of a separate tangent. I think that he's very much in the right place. I actually applaud Epstein for recognizing this as an issue, because it is the literal discrimination that Black Lives Matter is pretending is happening to blacks, and it is happening to younger blacks. That's absolutely true. It's not happening to older blacks. Like, young people are there, and if you think about it, apparently there's about 20 million teenagers in the United States. They are basically restricted from meaningful participation in the economy at this point. They are consumers in the sense that they can command money from their parents, and if they ever do get a job, but they're still dependent on their parents, they have basically nearly 100% disposable income. And he talks a lot in the book about the industry that caters to the teenage market, the various media companies, MTV and Disney and magazine companies, and he clearly finds them all repulsive. But what's interesting is in the end of the book, where he talks about what should change, he says we shouldn't do anything about those companies. We should just let kids, and I make the mistake there that he would chide me for, young adults, people who have passed puberty, if we just allow them to be free, they're not going to be interested in this stuff. They're going to have their job, they're going to have their wives, they're going to be out doing their own thing, being responsible for themselves. And there's another point here. When I listened to the interview with Woods, I kept thinking of my favorite revolutionary when it comes to education, and that it has to be John Taylor Gatto. I have several John Taylor Gatto books. I've listened to some amazing John Taylor Gatto interviews. That man is an iconoclast without equal in his field, and I don't even know if there's any other fields where there's comparable figures to him. And when I was listening to the interview with Tom, I kept thinking, like, wow, I really hope, I hope that Robert Epstein has heard of John Taylor Gatto. And sure enough, he is quoted immensely, especially at the beginning of the book. He presents two kind of contrary ideas of where we should move forward with kids. And on the one hand, he points out like these superintendents and principals out in California who are saying things along the lines of like, we should extend schooling. It shouldn't go to grade 12. It should go to grade 13, 14, 15. And should go for longer hours and whatever else. And that, wouldn't it be beneficial if people could stay in school until they're 22 or 23. And then he juxtaposes that with John Taylor Gatto. Now, John Taylor Gatto, if those of you who don't know, was the teacher of the year for the city of New York City 3 times in a row. The biggest public school district in the country, New York City, and teacher of the year for the state of New York once, one of those years. And he retired, I think, in like 91, 92, early 90s, started writing books, articles, doing lectures about the topic. And now his conclusion is that public schools should be completely abolished. And even private schools probably are bullshit, more or less. They're not as bad as public schools, but they're probably completely unnecessary. That children will learn what they want to learn. Trying to force them to learn other things is just ridiculously stupid. Brian Kaplan has a new book out, Against Education, kind of echoing a lot of this similar topics. I have that. I'll probably read that at some point as well. So the juxtaposition between the two different narratives is so stark. But one of the things that Gatto has talked about, and this is something that I kind of observe anecdotally as well, is human society is not segregated into the various age cohorts. You don't spend your day with everyone else who was just born in your year and not anything else. If you were born in 1990, you're not going to spend your entire day with a whole bunch of other people who were born in 1990 and only occasionally meet someone else. And that segregating along those lines is pathological, especially when you're talking about young adults. There might be an argument for this for little children, kids, prepubescent kids. Once you go through puberty, you are physically an adult. Your body is an adult. Your brain is an adult. And all the hormones, all the impulses is to be like an adult. You want to be treated with respect. You want to earn your way. You want to work hard. You want to have purpose. You want to be free. You want to have autonomy. And to be sheltered and cloistered and shuffled around is extremely aggravating and causes a whole host of problems. But one of the biggest problems is that all of your peers then become other people your age. You don't have any adults to deal with. You're not out on the job with your dad or your coworkers, in the office, whatever, who are people with all different ages. You are completely segregated, and you're actually not being socialized appropriately. You are being lobotomized, socially speaking. And that's what he believes is giving the market for all these ridiculous Miley Cyrus and Toon Disney and Teen Disney, and he lists a couple, and the book is from 2007, so a lot of it's kind of a little outdated at this point. But he goes, as soon as they really enter the workforce and they're on their own, more or less, and they're actually legally independent, their behavior completely changes, and they're learning from their adults instead of learning from each other. He talks about the exotic dress, the baggy pants, the talking about inane things constantly, like, he uses the example, so this is not my anecdote, this is his, of two 15-year-olds sitting in a coffee shop spending 2 hours talking about whether or not they're going to skateboard, because they can't do anything else. They can't start a business, they can't even work. More or less, most of what they can do is deny them. They're forced to go to school, which they are now at that point smart enough to intuitively understand how pointless school is. And so what else is there for them to do? He points out that there are some things that young people can do. So it's easier for them to start and run charities than it is to start and run businesses. So there's actually a lot of teens who have done charities, but very few who have become CEOs because they can't legally sign a contract. So it's like impossible for them to own a company. But in my own personal experience, I kind of remember going through this phase where like when I was younger, I was very dutiful and I would go to school and the teacher would tell me, do this, do that, X, Y, and Z, go home and do your homework. And I would go and do it. And I never questioned it and I never thought anything other than like, this is what I'm supposed to do. They're telling me to do this. This is what's expected. And I'm going through the marks. And I do remember, though, I was maybe around 7th or 8th grade where I was in geometry. And for some reason, like memorizing the angle, the formulas you would use to calculate the angles of triangles, of various triangles, whether they be equilateral or isosceles or whatever else. And I remember thinking, like, yes, being able to calculate these angles is like potentially useful information, but the odds that I would ever need to know it are practically zero. That like even back then, this is before smartphones and cell phones even really. Like there were computers that could do this. There were specialized engineers and mathematicians who could solve these problems, and that you weren't going to have to spend your day, even if you were a carpenter, calculating the angle of an isosceles triangle based on some formula. And you could always, if you ever had to, look up the formula. Right? You're not going to be in a test-taking scenario where it's denied you. And this is especially true now that the internet was coming into function. So I remember feeling like this is just really pointless. Like there isn't, like why would I expend effort doing this when I'm interested in other things? There are other things I'd rather expend effort in because I'm never going to use this. And as soon as that happens, your motivation for school completely changes. Now, there are some people who look at it and say, who make a rational decision that it is rational, right? You say, okay, I want to be a doctor. I want to go to Harvard. I want to go to medical school. So I need to have a 4 point in every class, and I need to take, AP classes, and I need to get an A on every test. And so whatever bullshit the test is about is irrelevant. I need to perform really well. Okay, that's certainly rational. And if that's your goal, then it makes sense to work in that way. But for anybody else, the majority of people, that's not the case. And all you're basically doing is jumping through hoops to meet social expectations. But the ability to jump through the hoops turns out to be completely a worthless ability. And once you go through that transition, and I never became like an angsty, terrible student or anything like that, but, I pretty much almost flunked out of several classes in high school because I was like, why? I don't care about this. I care about other things, and I have to come here and spend 8 hours a day, 8.5 hours a day, and there might be one class that I really enjoyed, and all the other ones were just time fillers, were completely worthless. Like I remember going to those classes. I remember the things that I learned, which weren't that many. It tended to be, and none of that stuff has ever been useful. And in my case, it didn't lead to a lot of teen angst or fighting with my parents or anything like that. But it leads to that with a lot of other people. All right, and school is part of it, but the fact that they can't work legally anyway. I'm sure that there's a black market out there of teens doing stuff. He also talks a lot about how labor was a big part of it. Organized labor actively worked to suppress young adults, teens from working. And this got basically codified during the New Deal, like so many other terrible parts of our country. And look, it's 20 million potential workers. By keeping them out of the workforce, we can raise wages or whatever, wage salaries of our members. So, yeah, I think it's a fairly radical book when you talk about like ending basically public schooling after elementary school, and it doesn't even sound like you'd be in favor of that. They should be able to work. They should be able to own property, sign contracts, to vote based on, and again, he doesn't talk about it, but the direct implication is that voting should be based on competency, which seems like an obvious thing, right? I mean, if you are demonstrably a dipshit and don't know anything, why in the fuck should you be able to govern? I don't see a really good argument for that, or against that rather. You can say it sounds like Jim Crow or whatever, but it's ironic in this context. We have Jim Crow, it's just Jim Teen Crow, who can't get a job or can't. Teenagers can't even like deny their parents medical procedures. On a slightly different topic that I all care very much about, I was reading about a guy who was uncircumcised at birth because he was sick. He was sickly. He had a low body weight, and the doctor said that he shouldn't get circumcised. And his parents were adamant that he get circumcised, and the pediatricians kept saying he's not ready. He's not ready. When he was about 8, they took him in, and he had a panic attack. And it's still, he was able to, by the time he went through puberty, he absolutely did not want to get circumcised. He enjoyed his foreskin. He played with it all the time. He thought it was amazing. He never ever wanted to get it cut off. He never had a problem with it. And all the way as late until when he was 17, they still had the legal right to force the procedure on him. And it actually took, it's a fascinating story. They brought him into a urologist to get circumcised, and they were having the pre-meeting where they discuss what it is, and the doctor is interviewing him, and it becomes clear to the doctor that he is not interested in getting circumcised, that he is there at the behest of his parents, who had religious beliefs as Christians that he needed to be circumcised. And at some point the doctor said, "You really don't want to get circumcised, do you?" And he's like, "No, not really." And he was like, "Okay, well, I don't know what the doctor apparently was uncircumcised as well, and said, "I don't know what the big deal is. I've been fine. The only people who ever worried about mine were other people. I always had no problem." He goes, "So here's what we'll do." And they had to come up with this contrivance where he went back to the parents and he said, "Yes, I'll circumcise him, but he won't be able to do any physical activity for about a couple weeks, and marching band camp is next week. So let's wait until after marching band season's over, and then we can do it." And he would turn 18 before that would happen, and so then he would be legally able to resist his parents. But here we have a 17-year-old who is adamantly against getting the surgery, and legally his parents could force him. Now, practically, if he starts fist fighting his mom and his dad, blah, 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 could it happen? Good question. But it's absolutely ridiculous, and it shows the arbitrary, again, people think, oh, there must be a good reason for this 18, the 17. No, there isn't. It's completely arbitrary. And it's fascinating. He talks about, there are things that young people can do to become adults instantly, to some degree. One is to get married. Okay, so most states allow you to get married before you're 18. Some of them vary by sex, so women can sometimes get married at 15 or 16. Boys can sometimes get married at 16 or 17. Sometimes they need parental permission, sometimes they don't. As soon as you get married, you become legally emancipated in most of those states. If you become pregnant, emancipates you to some extent, but ironically, if a pregnant girl has a child, she can make medical decisions for the child. She can decide, for instance, to get it circumcised or if it needs, vaccines or whatever. But she needs her parents' permission for herself. And then the other thing is to commit a horrible crime, right? If you kill someone, shoot someone, it's becoming more common to be treated as an adult, which he actually applauds. Epstein doesn't seem like he really likes capital punishment or anything like that, but he's saying, look, they're not kids, they're adults. They should be treated like adults, or at least if they're competent, right? There is the whole, if they're not competent, they don't know what they're doing. Sure, that's different. So anyway, I was very I love the book. It's great. He provides a very compelling case. You can take the test that he prescribes to judge adultness, and you could say, well, he made a test so that young people will pass. And it's like, well, no, adults don't pass it with any, they pass 1% better. It's not statistically significant. Most people 13 to 18 are going to pass. Some of them won't. Some adults won't. And again, why it's very selective to be like, well, I know some teenagers who are stupid and they couldn't possibly be responsible. Oh, so then we should make them all irresponsible and trap them in public schools forever. That's logical, because you don't know anyone who's 35 or 36 or 45 who's a total dipshit. You wouldn't go and say everyone should be like that. So anyway, I thought it was a great book. I look forward to reading the biography on Jane Addams. That period I've repeatedly find inferences. Before we had the progressive era, before we had the government policies forcing this on people, we had private entities that were training people, indoctrinating people, getting people to think that that was the way to go. And then those people then staffed these bureaucracies later and became advocates for the truancy laws, the child labor laws, the compulsory education laws, which kind of really took force, in the teens around World War One, and it's fascinating how it starts with an ideology, a private ideology, and then the personnel from that ideology ascend to places not necessarily of direct power. Right? I don't know that any of Jane Addams' acolytes became the president or anything like that, but they use their experience in something like in the various Hull houses to get on. Get into regulatory boards, to get on school boards, city councils, whatnot, and start to implement this stuff. Uh, and now it's kind of like a catch-22 where we've sequestered teenagers into the schools, we've drugged them up, we've prevented them from the autonomy that they were born to have, that they've already developed, and then they start to have psychological problems and go, oh look, see, they're not ready to be adults. So anyway, let me all know what you think, and I will talk to you all later. Bye bye.